friends, discussing this. All right, what happened? Even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what happened? They are very clear. All of them are almost uniform in their view that if nuclear weapons are used by one side, at however small a level possible, in less than 24, maximum 72 hours, it will lead to full exchange of nuclear weapons. So you'll end up with a mad situation. If it's not usable, what is the use of this? Why should we have it? The problem is, at one level, as people have called it, the nuclear weapons have become currency of power. I would say that this is more a symbol of power rather than a substance of power, because there's nothing much you can do with it except threaten somebody else. And that is where the use has taken place. For years and years, I've been tracking this to say the use of nuclear weapons has been during a state of crisis, when one country has threatened the other side with or without nuclear weapons. So such incidents do exist. In my last count, not counting the more recent General Kiani's statement, that very brash statement against the United States, that you don't fool around or you don't threaten a nuclear weapon country. That's a signal telling that watch out, don't go beyond a certain line. And the Americans did quieten down a bit, because you know what the consequences will be. You may not be able to get to Washington and the homeland of the United States, but half of the US military is deployed here in the Arabian Sea and around the place. It's in Pakistan, it's in Afghanistan, 130,000 troops. You can't afford to just wipe them off. So therefore, this is worth a study by itself. How the weapons have been used without using them physically. As I said, without counting this last incident, because I treat this as another threat by Pakistan to the sole superpower, that I have something which will make you not to do such things. Up to this point, there have been 54 incidents since 1946, where there was some sort of a crisis or even a war, where nuclear weapons were threatened to be used. The way the threat was conveyed was again in different logic, different language, and so on and so forth. There have been serious considerations also of using nuclear weapons. In the Korean War, that's the reason why General MacArthur was removed by Truman. In Vietnam War, where nobody got removed, but it just kept hush-hush all the time, but no nuclear weapons were used. There are a few other such instances. The interesting point as a scholar, researcher on this is that many, many times the nuclear weapons threat is less for the adversary, but for somebody else. Pakistan has held out so far, not counting the last one, against India, 4 such threats starting from 1987, the year it had nuclear weapons. Almost in each case, it was linked to the crisis in Kashmir, and the target, once it was used even during the Kargil war. But it's very clear that what Pakistan is trying to threaten is to convey a signal to Washington and the international community to intervene. That here, and you find that literature enormously. This is the real nuclear flashpoint: India-Pakistan, Kashmir issue, this, that, and the other. I don't think so. On the other hand, we need to be very clear that it can happen. The most dramatic example of a nuclear threat being held out seriously was 1973, the Yom Kippur War between Arab armies and Israel. Israel was caught in a massive strategic surprise. It was a holiday, they were off duty, other things happened, and particularly the Egyptians crossed the canal, and then the tanks rolled down till they got to these little high places. In the first 24 hours, first day actually, because there was not much of night, Israeli Air Force lost, out of the total 109 aircraft that were shot down, not by other aircraft, but purely in giving close support, ground support to the Israeli army, defending themselves against the onslaught. More than 60 aircraft were shot down on the first day itself. Another 30 was shot down the next morning. Why? Why did this happen? The Soviets had given SAM-6s to Egypt and to Syria. Israel knew that this had been done, but the Israeli Army, Air Force, did not have the electronic jamming pods for the frequencies on the SAM-6s. Because at that time, this was the hush-hush item at the top of the line in NATO and the United States. In fact, the United States had not even given these jamming pods to NATO. They had kept it for themselves, for their forces to use this. What option did Israel have then? When they pulled out the Jericho missile, they made sure that enough arty conversation and other thing will be picked up by the American signals intelligence. Americans flew the SR-71 over Israel, got the picture straight, the missile is outside. Washington informed Moscow that Israel is getting ready for a nuclear strike. At the same time, they released the jamming pods to Israel. By the evening, Israel had the pods, and from the next day, the graph of the loss of aircraft just came down to 1 or 2 per day. Made a big difference to the whole thing. Now, did Israel use nuclear threat against Egyptians and Syrians? No. They use it against Washington, their friends and benefactors. So you will find it again and again that this is where this becomes an instrument of politics or geopolitics or whatever name you want to give it, strategy. There's a lot more in this. I will only say this because I don't want to say that again in another context, that how did this happen that the numbers kept on increasing to such an enormous figure of 67,000 nuclear warheads? It does make sense. Both sides had a doctrine of first use. And when you actually go into a first use doctrine, you have to cater for a perfect intelligence as to exactly when a missile with nuclear weapons is taking off. So you put a whole plethora of satellites up in space. You have a full-fledged command centers. The US center is deep inside the Colorado mountains with series of massive 6-foot width steel doors which can only be opened by an electric motor. Human being can't do that. Throughout the Cold War and even now, most of the time, besides the command post which the President of the United States holds, the black box or the briefcase has been normally known, there was always an airborne command post 24 hours and 24/7 as the saying would go. That in case the Soviet Union does start off, that the retaliation will be immediate. That's how the world lived, on the edge of such things. Yet it came very close to instances where miscalculation, accident, what other problems could have actually triggered off a nuclear exchange. I think I mentioned that one of them was a flock of geese had flown out of Norway or someplace, and the NORAD, the North American Air Defense System, which is part of the Strategic Command, started to report that the radars are picking up the launch of a large number of Soviet missiles. So immediately the United States went on to the highest alert, now watching and what is next. Luckily it was quickly clarified that it's not the Soviet missiles. Now let me therefore just spend about 5-7 minutes, although this has been talked of in the earlier. Where does then the nuclear weapons play a role in India's security? Why was it necessary for India to have nuclear weapons? Because nuclear weapons, I am convinced, while I have argued in writing, verbally, everywhere, that we have to have nuclear weapons, but I know, and I say this concurrently, and we must understand the apparent paradox or the real paradox, that while nuclear weapons does provide us with defense through deterrence, but that is a shaky ground. Because you have the other side doesn't feel like getting deterred, but goes off and is willing to say that, which is where this irrationality factor starts to come in. And lot of Indians believe, which I don't, that the Pakistan army leadership or Pakistani elites, that they are very irrational people. They are not. Their basis of rationality and their logic of rationality is different from ours. And that's why the first thing that we need to understand in nuclear weapons of any country or the strategy is to find out why did they go nuclear. China went nuclear because it had been threatened by the United States on the Korean War, and also when the 1958 incident took place on the Taiwan Straits issue on two islands and Taiwan itself. Although they had started the nuclear program, but by 58 they didn't have the capacity. They got the capacity in 1964. Now you look at the Indian position, that in 1962 China launched a war against us. There's enough evidence now to say that Mao had decided as early as May 1962 that by autumn he is going to launch a massive offensive against India. There are a lot of other things tied to that. I hope somebody will look at the 62 war as a project, whether the fellowship at the center or otherwise here, because we haven't really, it's amazing that we haven't really looked at it. So how did we end up with that war? And how did we get defeated where we got defeated, which is actually in one sector, not in all sectors? And why did the Chinese withdraw? Having occupied parts of what they still claim, they withdrew. One effect was that the Chinese, by doing so, have demonstrated their superiority in military terms and withdrawn, denying us a war. Now the onus is on us to restart a war and prove that we can fight you out. And in a democracy, it's highly unlikely that this country will do this sort of a thing. But their target, their reason was the United States, and then when they broke with the Soviet Union. So both the superpowers were their adversary, and their nuclear strategy, nuclear doctrine, everything else was based on deterring the two superpowers, which had amongst them, as I said, about at least 66,000, because the remaining 1,000 were with Britain, France and China. And lo and behold, you can't prove it that deterrence worked, but we also know that nuclear weapons have not been used. What size? Uh, Once the initial build-up took place, the Chinese never had more than 20 ICBMs with 20 warheads on top. And when you add up the total, it has never exceeded 450. That's the outer limit, which includes warheads that will be under maintenance, will be under inspection. So usable one will be less than 200. And deterred the two superpowers. So you have to think to say, what is it that I need in India? When I say 2 to 3 dozen is the maximum that India needs, not the minimum. People get very worried to say that's all. And I am putting it on the safer side. That where I think I need one, make it 2. As we used to say in the Air Force, always add something for your grandmother or your grandfather. So the second one is for that. So why did we go nuclear, firstly? It's the same question that I said must ask when you are studying any country's nuclear things. India decided to go nuclear after 1964. When China became nuclear, 18 months before that, China had defeated the conventional Indian military on the Himalayas. Now they had nuclear weapons. So while the parliament passed a resolution, unanimous resolution in November 1962 that we must recover our territories occupied by China, now you have to think since then, if anybody thought about it, that would you like to take that land back of Aksai Chin, which is basically a desert, and trigger a nuclear war? I don't think it will be wise. So while the Parliament's resolution must be treated as very sacred, I'm afraid that that sacred has to be then kept in abeyance for an indefinite period till either politics sorts it out or we just forget about it. Because the stakes are far too high, much too high. China adopted a no first use doctrine but has never explained the details of this to anybody. China also kept this arsenal small, but for the last 25 years has been modernizing that arsenal. Now that's a far more costly option. To modernize the existing is much easier to build more, but it didn't go for that at all. So there are lessons to be learned from our good friend the Chinese, and we think we have learned that. Where does Pakistan fit into this? It doesn't. Although bulk of the time, even in normal cases, Pakistan occupies headlines in every way. This happened or that happened. Even here, we just finished a seminar on Pakistan's future. But really, does that really affect India? The point which I didn't want to make, and I want to make, but I left it alone, that the problem for Pakistan-India relations is that in the coming 20 years, India is already a major power in the world. It still keep growing, even if it grows at 8% against Pakistan's 2.5%. All that will happen is the Pakistani anguish, desire for revenge, and other things will increase. So I expect that their terrorism will increase in India, not decrease, regardless of what you can do with them. That is something that you have to find a solution separately. But Pakistan's logic was to go nuclear against India's conventional forces, so that we should not be able to punish them when they do something illegal or aggressive. That's a fact. Most of especially our serving military men, don't want to hear this, that we can't do this. But the political leader will be much clearer to say, don't do this. We can't risk. I ask myself from my friends and colleagues and youngsters, that is it worth occupying a part of our Pakistan? Is it worth it if you lose Delhi and Bombay in the process? you find it's not. You have to just accept it and carry on. And that's what's been happening in terms of what they've been doing. Because you have to all the time take into serious consideration that there could be escalation. Now, of course, one can argue that are we going to simply say that we'll do nothing? Which is spending now about 120,000 crores on the Indian Defence Forces a year. They have nuclear weapons. After that, they may happily can keep on doing terrorism and we could do nothing. Is that so? I'm afraid no. But there is a very clear strategy within the level of nuclear weapons and terrorism. There is strategic space that can be exploited if we are really pushed. On the other hand, Pakistanis are very clever on this issue. They have kept the terrorism at a certain low key, except when they've done this parliament attack and 26/11, which is to provoke you to go to war. In both cases, the provocation was that then released Pakistan from cooperating with the United States in the war against terrorism, and that war against terrorism is actually a war against the Taliban, which is the creation of Pakistan Army. And therefore it was sensible not to get into war, but if we get another one like this, the public opinion may actually force the circumstances. But in that case also, what we have to do is to make sure that we fight a calibrated, limited conflict where Pakistan's nuclear weapons cannot come into play. Now that may be a prolonged conflict or a short conflict. Either way, you have to impose a level of pain and punishment on not in Islamabad, but at least on Rawalpindi, the GHQ. You should change your policy or else. Otherwise, there's enough being done by the international community, by the United States to put that pressure on Pakistan. In fact, what they have developed, this whole logic of terrorism in the name of religion, that they have to fight those who have learned that art and are in opposition to Pakistan. That is why it's very difficult today to actually put out, make a judgment and say what's going to be Pakistan's future. Sensible logic would say that there is still time to pull back from this terrorism, to get back to a normal life, start paying attention to Pakistan's own interest and its society's interest, rather than this fancy ideas of strategic depth and trying to be equal to India or the others. For us, therefore, nuclear weapons only means that this is an instrument of deterrence against nuclear weapons. Do we need nuclear weapons to deter conventional attack? No. Unless we allow the conventional forces to draw down enormously. When it came down to 0.5% of the GDP as a defense budget, your reliance on nuclear weapons will have to increase. So therefore, there is an optimum level of conventional capability that you must have, that these minor skirmishes like Kargil and all can be not only fought, but can be won without allowing it to get to the nuclear level. Now, in all this, and it's a vast subject, but I do want to bring to your notice that a lot of things are changing in this scenario of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles and the others. Obviously, the BMD is just one of them. India is working, as you know, on our own ballistic missile defenses, which will be, in the initial stage, will be meant for shorter range missiles and progressively onto the ICBMs. Because the problem is that when the missile warhead, the re-entry vehicle, finally enters from the top of the ballistic trajectory, it picks up an enormous amount of speed. The ICBM could easily go to something like 7 to 9 kilometers per second speed. If you have a shorter one, which range of about 300 kilometers, 500 kilometers, then your speed will remain about 2 to 3 kilometers per second. But that's an enormous speed, because the interceptor missile has to have a higher speed than that. What's been happening is that technology has advanced sufficiently to allow that ballistic missile, even an ICBM, to be able to maneuver on its flight, either at the top of the trajectory or when it re-enters. India has been working on it, although will take much longer time. The United States has it, Russia has it, the Chinese are working on it. This is the basis, ladies and gentlemen, when you read about the Chinese strategy of denial of access to the US Navy, which therefore yesterday finally the Pentagon has come out with its own version to say that the United States will remain a Pacific nation, meaning that they will control the Pacific Ocean regardless of what it is, and have the means to be able to defeat this process also. So you have here war, conflict, weapons, now moving into arena which is not even thought of. We have now just about crossed 100 years of air power, but we are only looking ahead into air power that will be totally different onto hypersonic vehicles. The United States Air Force has already defined its purpose, its plan, which is actually termed Global Reach and Global Strike. Global Strike actually has been defined that the United States must be able to hit a target anywhere in the world in less than 1 hour. You can only do that if you have that vehicle or that aircraft or whatever it is, missile, traveling at somewhere about 25 to 30 times the speed of sound, which means that it has to be not in the atmosphere but on the edges of atmosphere or in space, but will have to enter the space after that. So the many developments that are taking place, the 21st century will tell us repeatedly that we are now seeing a totally new era where 3 or 4 powers will dominate the rest, even its friends and allies. And those are the 4 powers that I talk about: China, Russia, of course the United States at the top, and India, if it wants to, which is questionable. There is, of course, the larger sets of issues, which is enormous, the safety and security of the nuclear arsenal, because things can go wrong anywhere, anytime, anywhere. Things can go wrong internally. As it is, our nuclear power is increasing, our reactors will increase in numbers. We have in our nuclear security section project, clearly there were 3 items earlier: nuclear defense through deterrence, nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear power. I've added 4th item 2 years ago on nuclear safety and security, because those reactors also we must know to make sure it continues to be safe. What happened at Fukushima in Japan, while it was caused by a strange coincidence of an earthquake, a massive earthquake, and therefore also a massive tsunami, but the still fact was that there were design flaws. Fortunately, the damage levels have been low. It's got the world again to rethink. It's the 3rd accident over the last 70 years, and every time you learn something. But that itself is then a lot more things. Right. Any questions? Anything else that anybody may have in mind? I mean, I could go on for the next 2 hours. That's not the point. That will be a bit unfair after a long day. A device is basically that material, and you can have all the wires going anywhere else, because it's just a device that you want to test. A weapon has to be one that can be delivered with its safety measures, with its fuses, its design of the aerodynamic design that it can be carried properly either in an aircraft or fitted in a missile, depending on how you wish to do that, and so on and so forth. So 1974 test was basically part of the international effort, because in the 50s, besides this question of nuclear explosive devices as a weapon, concurrently also there was expectation that nuclear explosion can be controlled, which it can be controlled, that therefore it can be used for a large number of series of peaceful uses. And you'll be surprised, actually you should not be surprised, because Manipal University is one of the best medical teaching institutions. But in medicine, you find that the nuclear technology plays an enormous role today. When you want to go in for MRI or this, that and the other, it finally lands up with the same technology that's finally built up. Till 1974, when India tested, the IAEA itself had a program for peaceful nuclear explosions.